Welcome back. Next, we have a panel on Olmsted site evolution. We will hear from Pamela, Hartford, an independent landscape historian trained in architecture, historic preservation, and landscape design, and Jean-Luc Howell, the Director of Historic Preservation at Newfields in Indianapolis. The panelists will give their presentations, and then we will have a moderated question and answer session with Planningfield's President and CEO, Gina J. Wouters.
Welcome back, everybody. There we go. Okay, I have to reassure myself that everybody actually can see the slide. And I have to adjust my mic. Can everybody, can you hear me now? Okay. I am very honored to participate in this symposium. So in particular, my thanks go to the reading committee who found my proposal a useful fit for this program. My mandate for this panel is a focus on the site evolution of an extraordinary property designed by Frederick Law Olmsted in 1880 for Bostonian John Charles Phillip Jr. I am mindful that in the context of the Planningfield Symposium, I carry responsibility today for describing a project designed by Flo Sr., not by the brothers or the Olmsteds or the firm. FYI, the lovely typeface you see on this slide is taken from the letterhead of Mrs. John Charles Phillips, July 11, 1888. Beverly, Massachusetts lies along the Atlantic coast, 14 miles north of Boston. By 1879, when Phillips made his land purchases, industrialization in the form of manufacturing had incrementally subsidized subsistence farming on the thin, rocky soil barely covering the granite landscape of this part of New England. The 20-odd parcels Phillips assembled were situated between Cabot Street, a main artery running north from the town, and Great Wenham Pond, now known as Wenham Lake. You see here on the 1872 atlas that there were a few houses along Cabot Street, mostly owned by Dodges, a large clan clustered in North Beverly. The land had been primarily pastured, having been cleared starting in 1630. The road which crosses from Cabot Street, which you can just sort of barely make out on this earlier map, toward the lake in 1872, becomes, by 1892, in the second map, the central road through the Phillips landscape as laid out by Olmsted. John Phillips, the son of a minister, first began as a teacher after leaving Harvard, but eventually became an adept businessman, having been sent to India for several years by his firm, acting as an agent for the importation of various commodities. But his life was significantly altered in 1873 by a windfall in the form of a large inheritance from a third cousin who he had known briefly while traveling in Europe several years earlier. Phillips began a life of philanthropy. He became a trustee of the Boston and Albany Railroad, which brought him into contact with this key player in the Moraine Farm story. This key player in the Moraine Farm story, Charles Singer Sargent. In 1877, Phillips contributed substantially to Sargent's project of establishing the Arnold Arboretum. The same year, he purchased the Danville Silver Mine in Nye County, Nevada, not an untypical investment in those days. The next year, Sargent and Phillips traveled together on a botanical expedition to Nevada and California in search of potential trees for the Arboretum. One can assume the itinerary took the gentleman through Nye County, Nevada. One can also assume that Phillips had been entertained, probably more than once, at Sargent's splendid estate, a gentleman's farm in Brookline, near the Arboretum. Established by Ignatius Sargent and inherited by his son Charles, Holm Lee boasted not only cultivated lands, including award-winning grapes, but a full spectrum of trees and shrubs gathered from various points in the U.S. and abroad. Phillips made his land purchase in Beverly in 1879, while Sargent was deep in the planning stages of designing the Arboretum with Olmsted. In January 1880, when Olmsted visited Phillips's newly purchased land to determine whether he would take it on as a commission, it was Sargent, not Phillips, who accompanied Olmsted to the property. That was not the end of Sargent's involvement in the role of development of Moraine Farm, as we shall see. Across an extremely varied and relatively peripatetic upbringing, lacking formal education in the traditional sense, it was Olmsted's early exposure to travels in search of scenery in the company of his father and his father's profound reaction to those scenes, his reading of important 19th century writers on the picturesque and on forest scenery and trees by the time he was 15, his 3 years spent as an apprentice to a topographic surveyor, his choice to become a farmer, and ultimately his life-changing trip to England in 1850. That one can see in hindsight, these pieces are essential to the career that he fashioned. It wasn't until he was accidentally presented with the opportunity to design Central Park that he had his light bulb moment. So let's just take a moment to read these texts, both of which, one is describing the landscape of Hartford, which he experienced on his walking tour, and the other one is a description of Eaton Park, which is a design landscape by Capability Brown that he also saw on that tour. Of note in both descriptions, one of a designed place, the other of rural countryside, is the importance of trees, singly and in groups, for the shaping of landscape experience. Working at the Arnold Arboretum, Olmsted's primary job was to create a spine along which trees, placed singly or in groups, were to be displayed in taxonomic sequence, to be studied and to be admired. The road is all important, presenting scenes as one travels. Even more important is the role of topography in providing an ever-changing vantage point. Olmsted's mastery of road design, along with his deep understanding of the impact of tree architecture to create space in nature, are his signature and his brilliance. Olmsted felt that designing for residential communities and the planning of public parks was the most important work he could do, but designing private residences involved a number of issues for which he felt concern. Primarily, creation of freestanding residents because of the opportunity they offered to strengthen family, the most important civilizing institution in American society, and to improve health through access to sunshine and fresh air. He saw freestanding homes as the antidote to relic of barbarism, the row house. Creating the setting for a family residence would enable householders to foster their own individuality by expressing their particular character. In 1880, when Olmsted first traveled to the site in Beverly, he was established as a park designer, but he had undertaken relatively few private commissions. 4 in Boston, in the suburbs of Brookline and Chestnut Hill, 1 in Auburn, New York, and 1 in Newark, New Jersey. With municipal projects, the infrastructure of engineers and commissioners provided the necessary framework in which communications, planning, drawing, and executing took place. With private commissions, it would be several years before John Charles, Olmsted trusted deputy, established formal methods for recording communications with clients. Here we see in this list 5 letters that constitute Olmsted's entire written correspondence with Phillips. Obviously, there were site visits with and without the client in tow, but in 1880, those visits were not dutifully recorded. The 83 plans for job 12, number 12279, consisted primarily of sketches related to the siting of the house, those all-important sections, and grading plans noted yesterday by Patricia, and many iterations of working out the drives around the house. In the topographic study we see the existing landscape features: 1 large forested parcel, a low-lying pond outlined with a stone wall near Cabot Street, a house with orchards, gently sloping land below the moraine, which has several high spots. At the top of the map, lying parallel to the lake shore, is an oblong high spot, which I'm not sure you can see here, but this becomes the house site. So as you see in the instance, the house site was not set in the middle of the landscape at all. It was set up at the edge of the lake. Two sketches showing development of the house site. One on the left, a formal relationship to the lake with steps and a pavilion, not built. To the right, a sketch closer to what was eventually created. The elements of the domestic landscape include the terrace, a turnaround drive with an island in front of the house, a large lawn space, here divided by a road, and at the edge of a lawn, a pavilion with steps descending to a lower level where a garden is laid out in radiating beds. Of note, there are no planting plans for this. There's not one drawing of the entire property with regard to laying out the drives or location of ancillary, i.e. farm buildings. Presumably, Olmsted or John Charles would have staked the drives on the ground and worked out with Haskell, the surveyor, the levels. Olmsted's plan for Moraine Farm shows a very simple design. Farm buildings clustered in the historical location, the adjacent 40-acre field, Olmsted created by laying drains in the marshy area above what had been the pond, a drive to the house site on the edge of the lake, and 3 distinct carriage paths which loop around the site, providing a way of moving through the landscape and appreciating its varied settings. You can read the original extent of new forest plantations rendered in green. The residential area consists of the house, the lawn, terrace, and garden, secluded and distinct in quality from everything else in the vicinity, the very embodiment of domestic seclusion. The house, built by a well-known firm of Peabody and Stearns, is a massive affair of shingle and stone. Olmsted referred to the house as needing to be not a villa, but a forest lodge for the summer. The more bold, rustic comeliness and comforts you make the immediate artworks of the house, the better. Olmsted admired the stone, more charming on color and texture than any new stonework I have seen recently. So I'm going to sort of now go through some historic photos and then some new photos to give you a sense of the site overall. This is obviously shortly after the house was built, and there's that lovely little building on the left, which is kind of a shed for a carriage as it just parks near the house, but there was also a formal stable building set farther away. Here's a view north of the house, giving you some idea of what that landscape looked like when they first started on it. Note the terrace. If you see the house, just to the left, there's a flagpole. It's sitting on that terrace, which is an extraordinarily important feature of this house. It gives you an idea of how high that terrace is and how broad that terrace is compared to the house and the lake falls down below beneath it. It looks really vast, but it doesn't later on when it's covered by forest. This is the road coming down from it. Here's the flagpole, and there's the terrace. And the people help give a little bit of a scale, but they are coming downhill from it. This is the front of the house a little bit later on, looking up at the house. In the lower corner, you see the drive approaching the house enclosed by shrubs and trees so that the house just barely begins to appear as you come up the drive. And that was a very deliberate thing. And in the top image, what you see is along the house to the right, you see a row of hedges, sort of screening. The lawn is off to the right as well. The purpose of this hedges, which were called by Olmsted the impervious thicket, were designed to prevent you from seeing the lake, so that as you came up to the house, you only glimpsed it as you came around the corner of this road, and you had to get out of the carriage, you had to walk through the front door, and once you were in the front door, you could see across the foyer, through the glass doors, the terrace and the lake. Voila. Very deliberate and very controlled. It was one of the few very specific design mandates of this whole creation, of this very simple site, was this sequence of arriving at the house and having the lake sort of suppressed. So here are some shots of this really magnificent terrace. The lake is Lake Wenham. It is actually, in 1913, was created as a reservoir. It's a very fresh spring-filled lake that's just above the water table, so the water is always crystal clear. And of course, now that it's a reservoir, there are no buildings around it. There are no jet skis. It's quiet. It's beautiful. And I have and we'll get on to that in a minute. There we go. So here's some more shots of this terrace. It's very, very broad. The wall is of rust fieldstone. It has beautiful granite coping on top, which you can see in the lower left has lichens on it. Those are very deliberate. And it's just seat height. So it's actually a very, very large room. It's a very elegant space that you approach from outside the house. And in the lower right hand, you see the terrace leading onto this very, very long lawn. At the very end of the lawn is this little gazebo tea house. And that is basically the extent of the design of the property around the house. Is considered what Olmsted called a series of apartments, of very defined spaces and very, very private. There we go. So at the other side of this nice little tea house, which is in fact not just a pavilion, it's a closed building, it has doors, it has windows, it provided a space for ladies to have tea or do knitting or talk. It provided another space to be in the environment, in the secluded environment, but away from the winds. And the garden was sunken by 8 feet. Olmsted famously did not like flower gardens. Flower gardens don't occur in nature. And he didn't like their messiness and their distraction. And so, because the lady of the house always wanted a flower garden, he acceded to that and he created this sunken space. It's 8 feet below the level of the lawn, so that you cannot see it from the house. You cannot see it from the lawn. You can only see it when you're sitting in the tea house, or if you go down those lovely steps on either side. And as you can see on the right, you have this wonderful arch. He was, at the time, had already been working with Richardson on the bridges that were crossing the Fens in Boston. And he was also, at the time, building a house with Richardson about 2.5 miles from this particular location. You can see the influence and the collaboration. The stonework underneath here is absolutely extraordinary. The garden and also the lawn, as you see on the left, are surrounded by rough granite stones, upright. Dragon teeth, we call them in New England. There's actually a lot of stone walls that look like this. But the effect is incredibly rustic. Imagine how it would feel if those stones were in fact like a brick wall, which would be much more designed, much more deliberate. They signal a very close earthy relationship to the landscape, and they repeat this sense of incredible rusticness and incredible simplicity and emphasize being in the landscape. So that's a process photo, which helps you understand. The garden itself, the actual layout that he designed, which is sort of a variation on a goosefoot, is still very much intact, as is the pond and the little sculpture in the center. It's been replanted and modified in planting many, many years over the time, as gardens like this often are. But it's still an incredibly wonderful, special space below the house. And it serves a very important purpose in the future story of how this house is taken care of. All right, where was I? This is where, below the terrace, this is showing the beginning of the planting to fill in that landscape below the terrace, so that you're looking out over a very wooded landscape. And it took a long time. This begins in 1890. Oops, get back here. So John Phillips dies in 1885. That's only 5 years after the house was built. His oldest son was only 10 years old at the time. His oldest son becomes an ornithologist, a hunter, a naturalist, and he gets very, very invested eventually in managing the site. So as you can see, the site required lots and lots of planting over a long period of time to become what it truly became. And in his diary notes are very close recordings of how many trees were planted, the plantations, how the plantations were growing. So he becomes the sort of the owner and the developer, and he's working with Sargent through all of this because Sargent's making contributions to these plantings. Let's see. So here you see, against the lake, some of the pine plantings that are going in. He's working with a nursery that's in Beverly nearby. So he also noted in one of his notes that he was planting Doug firs, and he was very proud of this fact because we are the only place outside of the Arboretum that has Doug firs on our site, which is another reference to how much he was relying on Sargent and how much Sargent was helping him plant this. Without a planting plan, Olmsted merely indicated to Phillips, these are the things we want you to be doing. But because of Sargent's close relationship to Phillips and to Olmsted and their collective understanding of what tree plantations should look like, it sort of carried on in this informal fashion based on these pivotal relationships and understanding. So let me just pause for a minute and say, why farm, why forest? As opposed to an estate with, fancy gardens or whatever. Why such a simple, elegant place that sustains these very specific kinds of activities? I have no more excellent explanation than what Charles Eliot offered in his 1892 article published in Sargent's Forest and Garden magazine. Eliot said, the article was titled A Modern Massachusetts Farm. Eliot was very closely aligned with Olmsted's values on many fronts. He wrote of Moraine Farm, "It deserves the careful attention of all persons interested in rural economy, because it stands for what we hold as the fundamental principle underlying all successful agriculture, the adaptation of the crop to the character of the soil. This principle is well understood in most European countries, but the neglect of it in this has caused the unprofitable removal of millions of acres of valuable forest from lands suited by nature to produce forest, but entirely unfit for permanent and profitable tillage." So the role of this gentleman's farm was actually to be contributing to society in performing scientific agriculture and reforesting land, and also from someone's perspective like Sargent, an opportunity to try out trees in this kind of landscape, in this kind of soil, which was a glacial till soil, very sandy, very gravelly. And so it had a rationale of cultivation that was sensed socially valuable. So here in front of the drive, a specimen from Sargent. Around the house were some specimen plantings, but those were the only place there were specimen plantings. And I'm going to sort of run through a photo essay here so that after you see this overview, you'll get a sense of what the whole landscape looks like. It doesn't merit a lot of explanation, but I think it's wonderful to see how this whole thing fits together. In this 1929 aerial, you can see get a sense of proportion of the size of the lawn that's next to the house. It's a little bit larger than the house itself. It was obviously took a lot of filling to get that space, but it sets the house off nicely, and it was viewed as an apartment for family activities. And it's rimmed all along the lakefront edge in those wonderful upright granite stones. In the image on the lower right, just for note, there's a large rectangular pad that was a tennis court. So I ask you to just make a mental note of that particular spot. So here's a more recent map. Charles Beveridge visited the site in the 1980s. And he wrote extensively about it because he was very impressed about it. And this map where it says Moraine Farm since 1880 it accompanies a long piece that he wrote about Moraine Farm. But you see things labeled a little more clearly here. The South Carriage Road, the North Carriage Road, the barns, the irrigation pond, the agricultural fields, and the Salem-Beverly water supply treatment and distribution facility, which is very important because the Wenham supplies water to Salem and to Beverly still to this day. And you see the little house way up there, right on the edge, and taking up a very small amount of the space. But these carriage drives in particular, I want to draw your attention to, because they were specifically there to provide the opportunity to move through the landscape, see it coming and going, and experience the opening and the closing of trees and open landscape, and then views into fields which were carefully cultivated and named and said this field must always be open to keep an open space against an area which is forested. So it's a deliberate composition that Olmsted creating moving along these drives. So this is the main entry drive, and you begin to see the various different kinds of qualities of landscape on either side. An open meadow on one side against a big stand of rhododendrons that set off in a tier, the lower form of shrubbery, higher trees, and higher trees behind that. The clearing in the distance. The use of the stones to create a sense of New England. He framed the entire property along the street front with these old-looking stone walls. The only sort of, and John Dixon Hunt asked me not to use the word formal, but at one point, and we think it was the second set of owners, there was a maple alley created along one of the farm roads. You can see some of the farm buildings that are just barely discernible. The farm buildings along the side of the entrance road were screened initially by trees so that you didn't see them as you go in, but that's thinned over time, and so you do see them, but from a current visitor standpoint, having a glimpse of those farm buildings is actually quite nice. The farm buildings were built by Peabody and Stearns, sort of like farm building on steroids. They're not low rambling buildings, they're magnificent structures. This meadow we call the Olmsted Meadow. It's deliberate, it gets mown twice a year. And looking back down the entrance drive, so you see a mix of different trees spaced so that you can see between them. There's different varieties to create a nice experience. Woodland walks were created below the carriage drive, and what's interesting to note, at the woodland walks there were intersections where they would meet walks coming and going. And for instance, in the lower right hand, you see an accent tree, which is a beautiful multi-stemmed linden that just appears in a wooded landscape, but it's very special. It calls your attention to it. And in the other path, there's a copper beech tree, which when you do not expect to see a copper beech tree sort of in the woods, you expected to see a specimen, but there it is, marking that spot. The wooded walk, which Olmsted wanted to have a wooded walk below the terrace so that you could walk in a protected space, but in a wild-feeling space. That space was eventually filled with mountain laurels and rhododendrons, and this is what it looks like to walk through it today. There's one of the farm roads and a glimpse of a farmhouse. And the gatehouse, which is at the entrance to the property, slightly different style, but also all built by Peabody and Stearns around the early 1900s. And here's a glimpse at the whole ensemble of buildings. The barn, which is absolutely enormous and is an extraordinary building, and that it has an L behind it, and that's an extension. And then you see the smaller building, which used to be the hen house, which is now a cottage. That gives you a sense of the landscape that we're talking about. So ownership evolution. So Mrs. Phillips dies. Mr. Phillips dies in 85. Mrs. Phillips doesn't die until 1927. And 2 years later, a fellow by the name of George Batchelder buys the property, and here he is standing in the garden with his son, George III. You can sort of sense by this picture the kind of engagement that this second set of owners has with the property. They're not standing there wearing their horse gear. They're in the garden, they're working, they're very invested in the property, and you can sense this passage of values from the father to the son, and this sense of incredible attachment to this landscape. The house became a little bit more palatable as they removed the third floor, so this is an evolution of the property. wanted to back up a second here too. That's George Jr. and George III. So George Sr. dies in 1971. And his wife dies in 1977. When his wife dies, George III owns the property. What the bachelors did before they died was this, which never got implemented. This is subdivision plan. Right, right. I mean, they were thinking about what might happen, right? So the subdivision plan was drawn by Joe Hudak, who they went back to have him visit the site. They actually had him come and visit the site to talk about some more plantings around the house. And he made a planting plan for them, and all of the plants were to be taken from a nursery which had been established on the site at Olmsted's recommendation. So there was a huge nursery of plants that they were constantly culling from. But he did draw this subdivision plan laid over the old topographic plan. But this did not happen. There was so when the bachelors took over the property, the younger bachelors came back from California, and George III decided to make his life back on this estate that meant so much to him. And they were very invested in the forestry to the extent that they created a forestry management plan, which suggests a very serious engagement with this landscape. The forestry plan has to be filed with the state every 10 years. There are different trees, types of trees standing on the sites. I don't know if you can read this. There's white pine. Then there's one that says white pine hardwood. There's old hardwood. There's hemlock. There's red maple. And there's a Christmas tree farm, which the young bachelors started. Their son was so engaged on the property that their son and his wife had sheep. They started having sheep, and they sold the products of the farm. They sold wool and whatever. So again, you're seeing a family that is very invested in this property. It obviously means a lot to them, and they're enjoying taking full advantage of how it was planned to be used. So no changes have happened on this property. As of 1995, pine trees were still being harvested. The agricultural fields they leased to a farmer who mowed them for hay. So the agricultural fields were kept intact and being mowed regularly. So at about the time in 1991, the bachelors made a decision, how are we going to deal with this property? And rather than subdivide it, they opted for conservation and preservation. So they developed a great, very laborious, an 80-page document and working with the trustees of reservation and an organization called the Essex County Greenbelt, a conservation preservation restriction for the entire property that's very, very strict. And they then decided to sell parts of the property to owners who they hand-selected, people, organizations, nonprofits who would be able to use the landscape in a way that would not have any impact on the landscape. So the first buyer was something called Project Adventure. And Project Adventure, let me go back. So this is a Project Adventure map that shows the extent later on of how much forestry is actually on the site. And here's a plan that shows, it's a little easier to read, but what you see, there's a sort of a green area with a new building in it. Project Adventure builds a new building, which is the first new thing that happens on this site. It's an office because the house they have turned into a conference center for their business. So that's the newest iteration, newest thing that comes onto this property. PA eventually sells off a portion of this acreage. Let me go back to that. That's in blue, to a Waldorf Montessori school. The Waldorf Montessori school uses the office building as their schoolhouse building. Imagine what a great campus this is for K through 8 Waldorf Montessori School. So Essex County Greenbelt holds the conservation restrictions, and the trustees of reservation holds the preservation restrictions. So anything that's changed on the buildings or any of the built structures has to be reviewed by the trustees. Anything that happens on the landscape has to be reviewed by Essex County Greenbelt. Oops, I'm going the wrong way, sorry. So Project Adventure It was founded in 71. It's an adventure-based learning experience. So it facilitates summer camp, training programs, retreats, team building and leaderships, and they design custom challenge courses. These two images are taken in the pine woods at Marine Farm, where one of these amazing rope structures and challenge courses are built. And the climbing wall that you see here is actually a three-sided structure. It's about 80 feet tall, and it's three-sided, and in each of the corners, it's built upon 3 pine trees that existed in this location. So it's very organic, and you can see the picture below. You can almost make out all these ropes and things hanging, and they're just in the pine forest. It's a wonderful learning environment, and so that also has had very little impact on this site. This is the office building that PA built. It's now the Waldorf School. The catering business started as soon as PA bought the property because they needed revenue. They bought a very large piece of property, and there's a nonprofit, so they began catering in the site, which is now going great guns. And as you can see how useful all these sites are, the photo op for the garden is major. The lawn is used for weddings. There's anywhere between 4 and 5 weddings a weekend on this property. And that large tent was sitting on what I pointed out was the tennis platform in that square area across from the house. And it comes down in the winter, so it just goes up during the season. And as you can see, the terrace becomes a very useful, enormous social function place. So it works very well as a catering site without having too much impact on the landscape, interestingly enough. So the trustees are, as people may or may not know, were founded by Charles Eliot in 1895. It's the oldest land preservation nonprofit in the country. It covers the state of Massachusetts. It was founded by Charles Eliot. And so they were the first buyers of some outlying parcels. They bought 2 small parcels, one of which was the agricultural fields, and another was an area beyond the project Adventureland, was just some woodland, just to have an investment in the property. The trustees began using the barn and the agriculture fields for CSAs. And they own 123 properties in Massachusetts. They had CSAs at a number of them. Greenbelt, just so that you know, is a land conservation organization. It's based up in Cape Ann, which is this little turquoise spot here. And they own and manage lots of conserved landscapes, and they hold lots of conservation restrictions. So they're very well trained in what they do, and they're a very important partner in this group. So one of the most important things that the bachelors did in 2007 was to commission a landscape management plan by Sherry Berg, a very well-known, thoroughly professional landscape historian. The landscape management plan is like a modified CLR. It's much simpler, to the point, but it really gave the bachelors a way of, keeping an eye on the property. So Sherry identified all of the various important pieces of the designed landscape and gave them sort of a toolbox for, here's what you need to pay attention in this area, here's what you need to pay attention in that area. So how this site is managed, how you approach to designing this site. So the reference to the 2007 landscape management plan by the owners, the use of common sense in terms of understanding if you need to replace plantings, there's no planting plan, but you use common sense and you use native plants. When the property came under conservation and preservation, the bachelors set up a group known as the Friends of the Olmsted Landscape at Moraine, and they provide a sort of an advisory group. And so the advisory group with the Friends meets with Project Adventure, the Waldorf School, the trustees, and the Bachelor Trust, which owns the main parcel with the roads, which they hung on to. They have stakeholder meetings, talk about what's going on the property, what problems they're facing, and the Friends, who have various degrees of expertise, offer advice. And so that's basically how this site is managed. I have to say that the phrase common sense and native plants comes to me from someone who's very, very important to this property, who has been associated for a long time. When George III took over the property and was working on the property, There was a guy, a forester, who was working for DCR, which is the state-owned parklands in Massachusetts. He was working in the Blue Hills. He was a forester trained, and he got tired of working for the state. So he bought one of the Dodge houses next to the Marine farm. And he's only living there maybe 2 or 3 days when he hears the sound of a chainsaw. Magic to his ears. So he says, I need to find this. So he goes out in search of the chainsaw, and it's being wielded by George III. So you see the owner actively engaged. You see the forester who's now living basically around the corner. And Dave Phippen becomes the on-the-ground forester manager for this whole property and is intimately involved with the bachelors every single day. He walks the property. He knows what's going on with the trees. And so we have this informal advisor, like part of the family. And he has carried through since the family has left and through all these other organizations. He's still there. So the status right now is the trustees got out of the CSA business, and they put in that property, they've leased the property to something called New Entry Food Hub. The New Entry farming is a farming training program, and it's run by the Tufts School of Public Health. It trains new farmers. So you get a plot of land in the agricultural field for 3 years. You get 3 cycles to learn how to grow your crop of choice, how to do a marketing plan, how to do a business plan, and all of the produce that comes from all of these farmers in training get distributed through the New Entry Food Hub around the state to various kinds of populations that need food. So that agricultural field that Olmsted drained in 1888 has been in continuous production since that time, and it has a wonderful use today. Here's a view of those fields and some farm buildings that the bachelors added, some utility buildings. So the trustees, as of January 1st, purchased the largest parcel from Project Adventure. They had planned by 2008 that this would be a gem, a crown in their jewel of properties, and so they were sort of biding their time. And last year, Project Adventure decided they couldn't do it anymore, and they put up this for sale. And some developers came along, and they tried. But the preservation restrictions were such that they were all sort of not enthusiastic about taking on this property. And so the trustees stepped in. And with money from the city of Beverly, who helped buy the property, they purchased this parcel. They've leased it back to Project Adventure, so Project Adventure has no break in the action. And the trustees are working on a long-range plan to allow public access. This property has not been open to the public in all of this time because it's a school, it's Project Adventure, it's the trustees, but it has no public function. People are allowed to come occasionally give tours. Scholars can come and visit it, but there's no plan for people to be wandering around the site in public. The trustees now have to have some sort of public access. So in this plan, you can see there's a blue line, which are trails that they're going to try to reestablish that already exist from the back entry that goes along below the house and connects with a parcel that's at the north of the property, which used to be the property of one of the sons, which is now a nature reserve. But they're not going to do it right away because they have to take time to figure out how this is going to work. But they have a 15-year plan of eventually making this work and bringing it into a more public zone. So this past Sunday, they had their first public event. They have signage. They're big on interpretation. They allowed people to go into the house, into the garden, to really experience it. And they tried to give a real-time experience of what it felt like to be on those carriage trails. As Witold Rybczynski, observed, writing in 1999, in A Clearing in the Distance. Sorry. Moraine Farm is now surrounded by suburban buildings, but the forest that Olmsted planted is still there. The fields that he drained continue to produce crops. The graceful approach road and the sweeping terrace and lawn likewise retain a testament to their maker's skill and foresight, and to their owner's diligent care. 23 years later, the owner's foresight continue to providing a guiding preservation template, there to be carried out by the trustees. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jean-Luc Howell. I'm the Director of Historic Preservation. Thanks for having me here. It's been a real pleasure meeting a lot of you. You guys are a very intimidating crowd, but you're friendly, so I'm less nervous than I probably should be with the people in this room. Great, so let's just dive right in. I'm going to talk about, obviously, the history of Oldfields, which Newfields manages. I'll talk about the names a little bit. The development of the gardens there, we're going to highlight 3 specific to the estate, kind of talk about the transition from private to public, and then talk about kind of our stewardship approaches and things like that at the moment. Sorry? Oh, can you not hear me? Okay, sorry. I can use my presentation voice too. So Oldfields is designated a National Historic Landmark in 2003. Several people in this room helped us achieve that landmark designation. Thank you very much for that. It is because of the old Olmsted gardens, but also the people that lived there, the importance of the first family, the Landon family, and then the Lilly family as part of Lilly Pharmaceuticals kind of contributes to the significance of that. This is, you'll see the red dot on the map there, that's the Indianapolis metropolitan area. I should say that Newfields exists in Indianapolis, and as you can see, it is now an inner city site. Newfields is the umbrella organization of what was the Indianapolis Museum of Art. It was rebranded several years ago. Newfields encompasses Indianapolis Museum of Art, the Oldfields Estate, the surrounding gardens on that campus, the Virginia B. Fairbanks Art and Nature Park, which is a 100-acre art and sculpture park next door, and also the Miller House and Gardens down in Columbus, Indiana, about 40 miles south. It's kind of like just south there off the map. We really call Oldfields the historic heart of Newfields since it makes up our campus. The Art Association of Indianapolis moved to this site in the late 60s, and it consists of a main house, some outbuildings, which I'll go over. The first museum on the site opens in 1970, and it has operated as an art museum at that site since then. The Art and Nature Park that I mentioned before opened in 2010, so we're kind of slowly adding programs and developing the area. Just to talk about a little bit about stewardship before I dive into the estate. As I said, it's a National Historic Landmark, and it's oversaw within the bureaucracy of Newfields, with the Garden and Park Committee providing oversight. They're made up of members of the board, invited specialists, subject specialists, and they have final approval and oversight in all renovations, rehabilitations, intended use of the historic property. I kind of like the phrase just common sense. In stewardship, since the 70s, since Indianapolis Museum of Art moved to the site, they had no historic preservation plan, even though they were on this estate. And that was first written by yours truly in 2017. We review it every 5 years, which I'm supposed to do this year. I have not gotten around to it yet. Hopefully next year we will review it because it does need some revision. It sets the policy for Oldfields as well as the Miller House and Garden. It's all together in that one document. And in that, we state the significance, we outline the character defining elements of both sites, the integrity of the buildings and the gardens and how they stand right now, and also our decision-making criteria. We follow the Secretary of Interior's guidelines for treatment of historic properties and cultural landscapes. And it really just provides a lexicon for conservation initiatives. And I will acknowledge that our current historic preservation policy does need a little more specificity in it. When I first wrote it, our director suggested it be 1 page. And that wasn't going to probably cut it for the significance of both these properties, considering we're managing two National Historic Landmarks. Let's see here. So now, now it's 36 pages with some appendices, maps, and things like that. But again, it could use some help, and we acknowledge that. Prior to that, we were just following best practices. There was no really written formal policy for the care of the gardens. And I should say, I guess, that we didn't take on a Miller House and Garden until 2009. So before that, we were just owning and operating old fields. And just to mention one more about stewardship here, the staffing that really look after the grounds in the estate. We have our Deputy Director of Horticulture and Natural Resources. It's kind of the executive position. Then we have our Director of Horticulture, who does a wonderful job, has been there quite a long time. Then we have 5 full-time horticulturalists that take care of all the garden spaces. We have a plant record specialist for the database of the site. We have 3 ground staff and a literal army of volunteers and seasonal people to help us take care of the site. And then there is me as the Director of Historic Preservation, and I take care of both the buildings and landscapes. It's really more of a site management role on the estate. So let's dive into the good stuff of why you guys are here today. Have we flipped over? There we are. So Old Fields, we just saw a map, current map. So this map is 1910, and you'll see Old Fields is that red piece of pie in the upper left corner. It was founded in 1907. And eventually this area of Indianapolis will hold several other gated communities, estates, privately incorporated towns, and Old Fields is kind of the largest and most dynamic of them. It was developed by 2 gentlemen, Linnaeus Boyd and Hugh McKinnon Landon. They were both executives at the Indianapolis Water Company at the time. And the water company was prospecting for places to build a reservoir. At that time, Indianapolis was still very much a growing Midwestern city, almost a frontier town, I would almost consider it in 1910. And the water supply was not great. They were going to try to, their idea was to kind of flood that part of the White River, which is that bend near the red pie shape. And to, at the time, the one farmer owned the area that they wanted to purchase. Though the water company was only interested in the lower lands around the river, they didn't really want the upper land at all. So to sweeten the deal, Linnaeus Boyd and Hugh McKinnon Landon used private funds to purchase the upper tract. The water company got the lower tract, and everybody is happy. The farmer got his money, and everybody else got the land they wanted. It was a little bit of insider trading deal, sort of, kind of sketchy, but it all worked out in the end. They were upstanding citizens in the community, and after a while, people didn't, they let it slide, I guess. And so let's dive in a little closer here. So this is the site, an old aerial photograph. You can still see the bend in the river. And you'll notice that there's this triangle shape piece of land. The lower half of the triangle is the town of Woodstock, and it is the half of the land that Linnaeus Boyd owned. It would eventually be divided into 7 houses, as you see there. And then below that is a country club that Boyd was also the president of. Off to the right side is Crown Hill Cemetery. It's the 3rd largest private cemetery in the U.S. And then you also see, as I said, the natural bend in the river, and there's also a canal going along the right side of that white open field area. So there's kind of some natural boundaries to the estate, which become very important later for the preservation and upholding of the site. So the town of Woodstock doesn't become incorporated into Indianapolis until 1960. And at that time, the whole area is owned by the Lilly family, which is the second owner of the estate. Mr. Lilly would slowly buy up the town of Woodstock, those 7 houses, through the 50s and 60s, and again contributing to the preservation of the site. It's really the best you could ever ask for building an art museum in an estate. It's pretty wonderful. So if we dive into the estate itself a little more, you can see some pictures of the land and the house before Olmsted arrives. The main house is a 19,000 square foot kind of French chateau-inspired architecture on 26 acres. So Boyd and Landon originally purchased 52 acres, split it in half, and Hugh McKinnon Landon developed his area into one single estate, and Boyd subdivided the rest of it into the town of Woodstock I mentioned before. As you can see, it's kind of up on this high bluff that I mentioned before, and that's the private area. The lower area is where the water company was looking to purchase. And I should say now the lower area is where that art and nature park is today, the 100 acres. This estate is still very fully intact. All the original outbuildings still exist. There's a canal pump house, root cellar, service workers' houses of a chauffeur's cottage, a double, like a duplex kind of service worker building, and a barn. There was no stable. Hugh Landon was fairly progressive in lots of ways, and they never had a carriage. In 1907, and the house was built in 1913, and he had a 3-car garage. As you can see on the left, kind of the projection through the back of that terrace, it's a 3-car garage down there. There's a greenhouse as well, with a flower and vegetable garden out front. There was a little vernacular garden down by the canal that no longer exists. And the only additions that the second family, the Lilly family that lived there, they added a recreation building with an exterior pool and an interior pool and a 4 Seasons garden next to it. And they also added, once they purchased part of the town of Woodstock, they added an estate for their son called New Field, with no S. And New Fields is kind of a nod to that estate and the Lilly legacy on the land. The Landon family, the first owners, which I'm going to focus on because they're the ones who hired Olmsted, very actively used the land. They loved the gardens. Like I said, they already built a formal garden before Olmsted arrived, or Percival Gallagher, I should say, arrived to the estate. They were known to throw lavish parties, right? They were very much socialites and would be written up in the newspaper all the time as the must-see parties. You would come to Oldfields. The picture on the left shows a double wedding of the Landon daughters, which is the story we like to interpret and tell. The estate is still heavily used for weddings today as well. In the middle, you can see the greenhouses, the original greenhouses there, Lord and Burnham. The Lilly family, the second owners of the estate, would renovate those in the 40s, again, still Lord and Burnham design. And you can see the flower and vegetable garden in the front. The photo on the right shows the double cottage for the service workers and the barn below. Just to mention a little bit of the people that worked on the estate, we know from census records that there were at least 14 plus people living on the estate. So even though the families that lived in the main house, there were 5 for the Landon family and 4 for the Lillys, it was still a very active place, right? There were 14 additional people living in the main house or in these service buildings, everywhere from gardeners, security, greenhouse managers, and things like that. So it was pretty dynamic in that way. So let's move on to why we're here today. Olmsted. So this is a survey map of the land before Gallagher's arrival. And you can just see all the structures I kind of mentioned on the left side. The formal garden down at the bottom, that square box. There's the tennis court, main house as we move up the map, greenhouse, and then the double up top. And you can see it's very much, as the name of the estate implies, old fields. It's pretty flat, and we'll see some photos of that later. Percival Gallagher was first invited to Old Fields by Jessie Landon, Hugh Landon's second wife. On their honeymoon, they were at the Thomas Lamont estate in Maine and really liked what they saw. And they were like, cool, let's try to get this out in Indianapolis. So they write to Olmsted Firm. They write back like, oh yeah, Percival Gallagher did that design. They were like, great. So almost a month to the day after Jessie Landon wrote that letter, Gallagher was in Indianapolis surveying or doing his first site visit and taking photos. Gallagher would go on to work on the project from 1920 to 1925. So fairly long time. And this is kind of what he saw when he got there. His first impressions of the house is a concrete structure in a French style, simple and pretty well done. As you can see there, that's basically what he saw. Numerous outbuildings, and generally the place is developed and planted. Yeah, I'd agree with that. That's fine. But he goes on to say the approach is inadequate. The outlook's poor because of a bordering trolley line and highway beyond. Both are sunken below the general surface, so they can entirely be planted out. And you can see that interurban line on the right side of the photograph here, and then there is a highway just beyond that. He also goes on to say that I propose to them a more formal approach and treatment to this side, making a formal tree-lined vista straight out from the house, thus contrasting in character with the excellent broad overlooks over the country from the terrace on the other side. And we're going to come to find out that is exactly what he did. It's kind of amazing that he was writing these notes on his first impressions of the house, 2-day visit, and I think it just attests to Gallagher's kind of talent in that being able to see land, walk around it for 2 days, and he says, this is what I propose. And they were like, sure, that sounds great. And he goes on to execute it for the next 5 years. It's pretty incredible. And this photo is great because it really just shows you what he was working with, right? This is what he saw. A little later, I'll show you some photos from the ground. But as you can see, that vast expanse to the back, and that is, we are raised up slightly. You can't quite tell from the aerial views, but of those previous slides, you get great sunsets. Landon loved his sunsets. That's why he built this house kind of on that bluff. And so really, Gallagher's going to be working on the front of the house instead of just having these old fields. You know, once you have the name of the estate, they don't need to be around anymore, I guess, is what he thought. So I'm going to move through a few garden spaces now that they've designed, kind of from their development and then to what they look today, and we'll just move through a couple of these and then talk about them. So the first garden that they designed is the ravine garden. You can see in this picture, this is what Gallagher saw when he got there. It's just using the natural topography of the land. As you can see, the terrace there that I was mentioning before, so you can really look down into this garden space. And really where this photo is taken, you're not quite down to where the canal is, but you're close. And as I said before, the Landons love to use the land and walk around, and so they were also trying to find a way to get down to the canal. So the design for the ravine garden we can see here. Thanks to these great planting plans, they were incorporating these winding paths, kind of using the topography of the land to kind of wind your way and work your way from the canal at the bottom of the plan up to the house. They also introduced, I'm sure when it rained, there was already a stream there, but they formally made a stream and a pool from top to bottom. And you can also see to the right, they have paths going up and circling around to the existing formal garden, as you can see. And just to note, if you guys have ever looked through planting plans, I find them fascinating. But in each one of these kind of garden spaces, there's 2 numbers. The first indicating the kind of plant that they wanted there, and the second indicating the quantity. So along with these planting plans, there are also just plant lists. If the sites you work on have that information, like dive into them, it's really cool. And you can just tell by the quantity that they were planting, like they were massing plants into these things, really, I think, just to make an impact right away for their clients, right? They wanted they didn't want to have to wait around for 5 years to enjoy enjoy your garden. And I should also mention before some of his first takeaways of his visit. He specified that the Landons use this as a winter home, but also a spring and fall. So that's really where their interest lies in a lot of these gardens. In the summer, they would generally go away, probably to Maine. And so really that's what they were planting for, and that's the desire of the client, which will be important later as we talk about stewardship. So this is the completed garden. Beautiful, right? You have the nice views from the terrace, your winding paths, these fieldstone walls, bridges, very, very kind of naturalistic, and very much, as you can see, flushed out in plants. This is probably, I believe, only 2 years after they completed the project. And really it's talking about the views from below, but also you get a nice microclimate when you walk through with the water features, kind of cools you off in the summer if you're still there in the summer. And it's a quite wonderful garden space. And so, of course, like this garden is going to look like this for 70 years. You're going to still have the great views from the terrace, unless the trees grow, and they did. So 70 years later, the museum at this point owns the property. The Lilly family, as I said, added a recreation building and a Four Seasons garden next to that building, but didn't really touch the Olmsted designs. And so they kind of got out of hand, as you can see a little bit. There were pioneer species that had moved in. The trees, obviously, that were kind of blocking the terrace wall had gotten a bit too tall, and you couldn't really enjoy the garden as much as you would want to. So the approach that the museum took was a restoration approach. Patricia O'Donnell was instrumental in this project, and she can probably talk a lot more on it than I can, since I was not working there or involved at the project at the time. But we'll try to recap it for you. Since we did have all the garden plans and the planting plans, they did a full knockback of the garden, but they did document all the hardscape, all the stones, so that we could do a full restoration to the 1920 design and keep it quite accurate. They did improve the infrastructure for the pools and the streams to make sure they operated correctly. And of course, if you guys ever had a water feature or a swimming pool at your house, we're still doing that, right? We're still trying to improve those infrastructure and everything. But as you can see, the garden was clear cut to make way for this restoration effort. And really just following the detailed planting schemes and the original plantings, we were able to restore the gardens back to its original beauty, based on diligent research and really trying to reference that original spring and fall interest. Since the replanting in the late 90s, we've had to replace a few trees just due to disease or storm damage. The horticulturalist that is in charge of this space does have a planting and maintenance plan that they follow diligently for this. And as I said originally, and this is obviously a springtime view, but originally it was planted for the spring and the fall. But now that we are a public museum open for the summer, the horticulturalists have tried to introduce a few plants that are also going to be blooming through the summer months, just to add that interest for our visitors. Otherwise, people would come to Oldfields and just see a green garden, essentially, in the summer. But they do try to find plants specifically that would be available in the 1920s for this garden to try to keep that element intact. So that's the formal garden. We're going to move on to the largest element, our garden element at Oldfields, which is the LA and the Border Gardens. It's really the solution that that Gallagher came up with for this front of this house that I mentioned. You know, we're trying to really find something great to replace staring out to old fields, literally on the front of the house, trying to block that interurban line, trying to block the highway. And they're really just factoring in the grading and looking at the drives, and really trying to orient the landscape to give a vista, right? Like all these plans that we've talked about earlier the last couple days, they're always talking about vistas, and we don't have any volcanoes in Indiana. So they had to kind of, you know, make your own, and it's just the genius of Gallagher was able to do that. Did I go too far? Yes. Okay, so this is the view from the house and towards the house that Gallagher took on his first visit. As you can see on the left from the house, you can see the drive. You can kind of see the electric lines way back there in the tree line. At the front of the house, it's not really framed up that well with the trees around it. You can see the tall field grass, and you can kind of see the asymmetry of the house that we have there. So the alley plan that Gallagher came up with is just straight on out from the house on the axes at the very center of the house, though in that French chateau style, the front of the house is actually to the right slightly, so it doesn't line up with your front door, but it does line up with the center pavilion, I guess we kind of call it, of the house. And this whole idea, as you can see, we have the structure of the alley with kind of these meandering paths on both sides is kind of the idea, kind of, I'm going to say it, more formal versus the informal. And the open lawn versus these kind of beautiful, beautiful passages that you're able to meander and walk through. Looking closer at the alley, maybe. And we don't have a planting plan of this like we do the ravine garden. We know a few of the bigger trees, but the seasonal plantings, we don't quite know those. Okay, so looking at the LA specifically, I just want to point out a few things that they went through. So the original plantings were all elms. Those unfortunately did not survive, and they're currently red oaks that line the LA. And to help with this vista, they really did a great job using this forced perspective, right? So they were planting 4.5 inch caliber trees near the house, and they get smaller as they go away. It's maybe 200 to 300 yards from the end of the circle to the house, so it's not a great distance, but with this forced perspective, you're able to kind of give that idea that it is much greater than it really is. It also helps that it was much wider at the house, and then it gets narrower. What's not shown in this plan is just the tree study, is that in the center of that circle out there, there is a fountain, which also, lets your eye travel to the end, and then there's also a sculpture of the three graces at the very end. For all of the people that love grading, we'll show it again here. And this is really showing what Patricia was talking about before, about hiding that drive, right? So to the left side, there is a bit of a ha-ha. We're not keeping the French out, but we're trying to hide the drive from the front of the house. It's deceivingly simple feature, this alley, but great thought and care went into creating these things, which when we have guests walking around, they're like, oh, great, it looks like my lawn. And then you stop and bring them to the front of the house and show them these details that just the average visitor to the garden aren't always going to pick up on. So I appreciate a room like this of people that kind of do appreciate it a little more. And so once the LA is finished, let's talk about one more thing before we do that. Some of the biggest controversy in the letters between Landon and Gallagher was the size of this alley. On the left is version A, and the right is version B. On the left is what the Landons wanted. They wanted a slightly wider drive so they could pull around their cars and kind of access the front of the house much more easier. Gallagher did not like that wider road, and he was fearful of its good appearance, right? He said that he aligned the trees quite carefully with reference to the architectural lines of the house. But then, the client replies, "We do not care for Plan B, but Plan A does meet with our view. We are very sorry they do not feel that the wider lawn space at the front of the house is desirable." So they're kind of spitting back and forth a little bit. They go on to say that they're more concerned about the view from the house and not so much the view from the garden to the house, which is kind of what Gallagher was interested in. At the end of the day, Gallagher is going to acquiesce to his clients, and he's saying, after all, it's a mere refinement. Although he took the time to do 2 drawings and write 3 letters for just a mere refinement. So you can take from that what you wish. I should point out, though, that the Lilly families did eventually expand the house about 12 feet on the left side. That was just a sun porch, and Mr. Lilly was an avid collector of books and coins, and so he expanded that to be a library. So at the end of the day, Gallagher kind of won, because with that wider alley, it then matches the current architecture of the house much better. So it was kind of a win-win for everyone involved, actually, which is kind of a fun little story. So the after pictures of the same view that I had before, if this will work. So on the left, you can see now from the house, the drive is gone. It is now slightly lower than the drive, and you have this beautiful expanse of turf. You can see the alley is newly planted there with the ravine or the border gardens on both sides. And from the right, you can see the pool, and you have a little more formality framing the house. Again with the F word. I'm sorry, I keep dropping that. These are views of the space today. From the left, you can see it's very much framed up now that the LA has grown. And we use this space pretty heavily. The center photo is of Penrod Art Fair. It is a large one-day art fair. We see about 30,000 guests on one single day. To that space, it's an art fair that started in the 70s, so almost directly when the Art Association of Indianapolis took over the estate or moved there, we started inviting this art fair, and it's now tradition on the grounds, and it brings lots of people. It's a pretty lovely time. And on the right, we're showing a picture from our Winter Lights seasonal program. So we kind of turn the alley into this lit parterre. We call it the landscape of light. I don't think it's anything that Gallagher would have thought his alley would have been used for, but I think it's a great vision for what is possible in some of these landscapes. It's almost like skateboarders using downtown features of the built environment for something completely different than the designers and engineers would have thought, I think much to the chagrin of city planners. We do worry about soil compaction for the LA. We have had a few losses of the red oaks even, and we replant them, so there's not too many. I think there's less than 5 that are smaller caliber than the rest of them. And it's a constant conversation. Because of it only being 26 acres, not 400 acres. Like planting fields, if we were to try to replant the LA, it is now close to other mature trees, and there's lots of issues with light and things like that. So it's kind of be a hard decision to make and see how that plays out eventually. Right now, we're just trying to be good stewards and do a lot of preventative conservation for the area. Laying down mats when we can, trying to avoid heavy, vehicles driving on the grass, etc. Too far. All right. Too far again. All right. So the border gardens. as their name suggests, bordering the alley. They're the main strolling paths of the garden, and they really isolate the alley from the adjacent pasture to the upper section of the map, and also to the open area of the vegetable garden, which is now known as the orchard, to the south. The border gardens were originally planted in full sun with these beautiful lawn pathways. They're planted with flowering trees, evergreens, shrubs, and seasonal plantings. Again, focusing on this spring and fall interest that the Landons were concerned about. 100 years later, they are not in full sun. They are now woodland walkways. Dappled, some are very heavy shade, some are dappled shade. The lawn just doesn't perform well anymore in this situation. And as you can see in these photos, some stone paths have attempted to be laned to help take care of some muddy spots and some heavier traffic use from our visitors. And that still creates complications though, right? You still have a lot of trip hazards, especially when you invite the public. It's very different when you have 5 family members and their guests and party guests walking around. But when you're inviting the public with accessibility issues, it can still become a problem. So we've recently did a rehabilitation project for the border gardens. Maybe we did. I forget if we did. Oh, there we go. And have introduced hardscape to where the lawns used to be. This takes care of our lawn problems and accessibility issues, right? So now we can provide wheelchairs, passable in all weather. So it's not just a fair weather garden that you're strolling through. We have also incorporated some additional seating to the space. And while we did this, it just helps with the infrastructure for programming, right? We've also included some conduit for lighting, fiber for data, and speaker wires. And so as you can see from the landscape of light, if we want to extend the winter lights programming, we can take it through other garden spaces and kind of expand that, which is a very successful program and helps pay for a lot of positions at the museum, which is key when you're a nonprofit. Oops, let's go back. Just some more photos of the rehabilitation and some talks about it. At the time that we redid these paths, the horticulturalists also addressed some plantings. Over the years, there were kind of some gaps made between the border garden and the alley, just from visitors, taking their own path and kind of doing what they wanted. So we took some time to fill in those spots as well. We moved around some specimen trees and shrubs that were not doing as well and kind of out competing each other over the last 100 years. We do have still some original plantings there. We have some beautiful flowering almonds, some mock orange shrubs are still in the space. And really when we first took over the gardens, it was very much more strict in our planting scheme. And we were only kind of focusing on what's been available in the 1920s. Since then, we've kind of opened it up a little more. You can now find chartreuse and variegated leaved things in the garden space, again, trying to add this interest to our public as they move through the gardens. Again, still focusing on blooming time, size, and other qualities of the garden that match the original. Oftentimes, these plants are also easier to maintain, which helps us with our staff and everything. So just to wrap up this talk, I wanted to talk about one concept that I've learned recently from Randy Mason at Penn Praxis. Penn Praxis helped us with our master plan, was one of the helpers there, and also with our conservation management plan down at Miller House. Tolerance for change kind of imagines change as a constructive force and gives more weight to the non-material expressions of cultural significance, like use or experience or understanding previous cultures that use the land. We are actively working on a land acknowledgement. It kind of contrasts with the more traditional policy approach based on defining appropriate levels of intervention. So kind of looking towards the more typical Department of Interior guidelines. It assumes the material condition is always the most important index of significance, although significance might reside more strongly in use or function or meaning. And so tolerance for change, kind of thinking about that way, kind of open those things up. You still kind of have to be careful though, because you still want to keep intact the spatial, structural, and functions and character of the original elements as you're talking through and kind of figuring out what these, again, tolerances of change are. You know, going back to the border garden example, like, can you introduce hardscape into a meandering path and still, does it still hold true to the design, right? And when you're talking about issues of accessibility in a public site, that becomes more and more important. It allows us to also talk about new uses and experiences within the garden. We recently did new interpretation in the spring. We started doing smartphone device tours that do, you know, the typical interpretation of the historic estate, but we also introduce a tour of mindfulness and well-being. So kind of going back to these Olmstedian ideas of the healing powers of nature and things like that. And really, after hearing the talks yesterday and today, can you take that one step further as we learn more about Olmsted, maybe his ideas of race and equity? Can these Olmsted gardens be places where those conversations can start and expand, and you can invite the public in to kind of talk about these issues in a very, you would think, non-confrontational or very like democratic, literal landscape, but you can really maybe have tough discussions in there. But that's only possible if you can make them more accessible to people through that. It also allows us to kind of think about and how to steward these spaces as we open up these large seasonal programs. I showed a picture of winter lights, but we also do spring blooms where we introduce between 300 and 4,000 spring ephemerals, bulbs to the gardens, not just to the gardens, but also to old fields. And we also have a fall seasonal program called Harvest Nights, where we really use the history of the state and then make things a little spooky, not scary, right? So the main house, we have beautiful projections on the front telling a story, and we invite guests inside to kind of experience kind of haunted old fields. All these things are possible if we just change slightly maybe how we approach, how we think about these places. And it's really going to, I think, help old fields and in turn new fields move to the next 100 years stewardship and care for the site. Thank you.
So in the interest of time, we're running over. We're not going to do our fancy setup with the chairs, and also I'm going to ask Pamela and Jean-Luc to come back up and stand next to me so we can take a question or two from the crowd. Does anybody have any burning questions? If not, I do. No? Nobody?
Mountain laurel is a shrub. It's a lignous woody shrub that the leaves stay on the top and they eventually. Microphone. Yeah. I'm very sorry. A mountain laurel is a woody shrub. It blooms about 3 weeks later than a rhododendron, and it's an evergreen. So So what you saw were the branches underneath, which you don't normally see because it's covered by green. But that's what that is. It's probably.
There's a wild natural patch of mountain laurel flower over at Francis Pond.
Well, it blooms on the woody branches like a rhododendron. Okay, so it's not something that grows on the ground. It's a shrub that gets large and large over time.
Okay. So I just wanted to, any other questions? Because I just want one comment as we transition to John Reddick. You both ended with really talking about the public. I think that's really important. You may have been seeing some photo shoots of brides outside. And I think that it's really interesting to think about these sites, these two sites, and planting fields where you're at right now as well, as sites that were exclusive for very wealthy families that are now public sites or going to be having public access. And I'm not going to ask you the question just because of the interest of time, but put it out there. How do you negotiate the Olmsted intent with that, knowing that now we have hundreds of thousands of people coming to these sites? You talked about year-round seasonal plantings as an example. I think that's really interesting. We're doing that too. Yeah, I just want to leave it with that. But I think at this time we're going to hear from John, right, Emily? Yeah? Okay, thank you.
I'll try to be brief in the interest of our time schedule here, but it's been 3 really amazing days. And I think about the first days and sort of talking about planting fields and its history, going back to the Native American sort of naming, evolving from the Native American experience. John Dixon Hunt sort of setting the English model in advance of how people were thinking, or Olmsted was contemplating the space and sort of setting moods. As I was saying, as I walked through the house, I was thinking of film and other things that I've seen. Rebecca, if you've seen Hitchcock's Rebecca moving through the hall, or Heathcliff and Emily Bronte's, the sense that that's where the general public has sort of been brought in some of the storylines, and hearing that talked about. There's realize there's an opportunity to bring that sort of that literary, because they started as great literary works, bringing that back into the conversation, the contemplation of the spaces that we're in, and to hear the next day the history of the codes and going forward about the housing that was here first, the fire, the palimpsest of where we are, and that kind of history that talks about personal engagement, the loss of the house, and yet the view was so significant. The next house built on that past success. And to be followed by the next day, and to kind of talk about Olmsted, the person and his travels. Sarah Zodi was talking about Olmsted traveling through the South, and really clear-eyed. A lot of times when you talk about things that are sort of rough in American history, and particularly as African-American, these topics are coming up, I sort of feel like the non-African-American audience starts to go, oh, we did something awful. Right? But the great thing about Olmsted is he was clear-eyed about his time. And we wouldn't have these records if he didn't just say, well, I can't talk about this, I can't do this. This is what I'm seeing. This is the economy that's producing a certain crop that's based to the land, but here's the inequity in that. The inequity to the land, in some cases in terms of what it did to overplanting and a certain crop to the land, but also what it did to the people. And seeing democracy, there was a debate about whether those writings had anything to do with his work or not, but how can somebody with that broader thought not be thinking about what public space can do for the public? Even when he's looking at housing, he realized, okay, he doesn't like city row houses, but he thinks the family unit should have something different. He's thinking about all those things in a very human way. He's using nature in a very human way. The fact that he's so focused on native plants and doing inventory of native plants, he's starting to think there's something wonderful here. I go to California and see plants I have never seen before. I want to use those plants. Even when the people in California go, I've seen it, I want some other fancy thing. He's always bringing this broader conversation back, and I think that's very, very special and unique. And so to hear today talking about Olmsted a little more, to see him set in the period of other artists, like Winslow Homer, and how their point of view changed, the people who lived through the Civil War. We're living through very difficult times right now, to me, with the same kind of divisive issues, half's the Confederacy, half's the Yankee side of things. And so having somebody that's looking at those things in a clear way and trying to bring people together to build conversations. I do think Parkland and the way that Olmsted looked at it was about bringing democracy to the space. You come in and it doesn't matter if you're Italian or Irish or rich or poor. Oh, isn't this beautiful? Or look how I'm able to move through space in another way. And I feel he was like, I was talking about movies, but I felt like he was a movie director before there was a movie director. The path was the cog in the film footage. He knew where you were going to go, even though you didn't. He made you make turns. It made you feel there wasn't a long stretch of a numbered street like in New York City. He's going to curve and make you feel like your little section. And I know the Swansons live maybe a little over the hill there, but there's a sense of village and beauty and a kind of picturesque sense of the world. And so having heard about Olmsted and his personality and how this is all trying to come together at this one special place, it was really wonderful to hear about the plans that you have already under way. And Ms. O'Donnell, is she still here? She is working in the spirit of Olmsted. We talked about Olmsted and how he looked at the time period he was in, and she's bringing all the issues of our time to bear in the discussions of looking at this landscape and what this landscape could give back to the community in terms of environment, social gathering, how you can still keep the honesty of a tree planting, but maybe change the spacing a little bit or do these other sorts of things that still capture the spirit of another time and another designer, but carrying it forward. And then I worked in Prospect Park when we were doing some landscape changes, and the historian there was a fellow named Rex Wasserman. And when you talked about the dogleg turn here, I never would have made that connection till you made talk, and then it was vividly obvious, like everything that's obvious. It's obvious once someone tells you. But I remember Rex pulling out old stereoscopes and postcards and how much time they spent to try to figure out what type of tree that was and how pinched, how close, how far, so you could still get the sense of the view, but it's kind of filtered. And I feel all that's going on here. And I used to be congratulated for the wealth of really kind-spirited and generous spirit players that have come together to look at similar spaces. We sort of know from the talks today the inventory that's in Long Island. And there's a story to tell not only with this property, but adjacent properties, settlements in Long Island, and all that. And so I think about tourism, I think all the other kind of things, the educational possibilities that this linked with that other history can bring not only to planting fields, but also to the Long Island community. And again, the level of engagement that makes the public see in this big scale exercise, some smaller scale exercises that were going on in their own community, styles of architecture, public accommodation. I grew up in Philadelphia, and the train lines there, the main line and others. My mother grew up in a town called North Wales, and there's Lansdale all along a train line. And when you got off the train, there was a little English village to meet you when you got off the train. And you can still see that in Long Island. You talk about Forest Hills and those other places. Well, the same inspiration that was in that house is in that scaled down, thinking about what's the average man or the sort of rising working class to get them out of the congestion of the city. What do I want to give them? And we go back and look at it, there's so many wonderful amenities that were in that work. Robert Ventura used to say, great architecture can stand the second look and a third look. And so those little things that we don't think about, in a time when we're maybe not thinking as much as we're going to the internet and trying to figure it out, the spatial life of how we navigate the world. There's ways to see that and bring that back to communities, and I think Planting Fields has an opportunity to do that. And it's in public hands. The other day when we were hearing the projects that were looking at volcanoes and building on cliffs that were affected by earthquakes and all that, I felt like, doesn't anybody remember Pompeii? It's like, And so, like, challenging nature as opposed to embracing nature. I thought that was sort of interesting comparison. And even in the Ohio, there was a benefactor who owned, National Cash Register, and he did all these wonderful things. But when he wasn't around, was that still embraced by the city that had the advantage? In some ways, it looked like it slipped away. Some looked like other institutions got a hold of it. And here at Planting Fields, now you're partnered with a state agency, both of which Anthony and is the deputy here. They were both saying, apologizing, intimidated. I think we're all great scholars, and they so love their work. They so spoke lovingly, and everyone's leaning over to ask you questions, Anthony, about where they can get and find stuff, and that's a gift as well. And it takes team building in the way that you think about Olmsted and the people we work with and the respect for what everyone brought to the table. And so I think you brought a lot to the table with this group of players. I think you all were very, very generous in your information and time, and I have great hopes. I'm 70-some years old, and I keep thinking about my growing up and what's the world going to be for the next generation. And I think you're doing some great things for that generation. So thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers over the past 2 days, and thank you all for coming. That concludes our Olmsted Symposium. We welcome you to stay this evening for our reception celebrating the What's Out There Olmsted on Long Island guidebook and weekend of tours. As you walk out, you'll see some food. Help yourself. The bar should be open now. There will be shuttles leaving for your hotels now and also at 8 p.m., so we will get you back if you'd like to stay. Thank you all very much.